Walker had always dreamed of living by the water. When he finally bought his lakeside home, it felt like the reward of a lifetime of patience and hard work. The property wasn't just a house to him, it was a sanctuary. His favorite possession, a modest but well-kept boat named the Horizon, was the heart of it all. On quiet evenings, would sit on the deck, watching the sunlight dance on the water while the Horizon rested calmly at the dock. To him, that boat was freedom, peace, and a reminder that life could be steady even in uncertain times. But the peace valued so much soon came under threat. His neighborhood had a homeowners association, and its president, Richard, was a man who enjoyed being in control. Had served as president for years and treated the position not just as responsibility, but as power. The board meetings were less about managing the neighborhood and more about showcasing his authority. When first noticed the Horizon tied its dock, he frowned. To most neighbors, the boat was just part of his charm, a harmless hobby that caused no disturbance. To, however, it was something else entirely, an opportunity to remind everyone who really set the tone in the neighborhood. One morning, opened his mailbox and found a neatly folded letter on HOA letterhead. The letter declared that his boat violated aesthetic standards. It demanded removal within 30 days. Read it twice, baffled. He flipped through the HOA handbook he had received when he purchased the property, scanning every page. Nowhere did it say anything about private boats docked on privately owned waterfront property. That evening, walked the shoreline and noticed other small watercrafts nearby, canoes, kayaks, even paddleboards, all resting peacefully without issue. His boat wasn't larger than some of them, nor was it an eyesore. The complaint, he realized, wasn't about the boat. It was about control. Decided to address it directly. At the next HOA meeting, he sat quietly until the floor opened for homeowner concerns. When his turn came, he stood, letter in hand, and calmly asked for clarification. "According to the handbook," he said, "there's no clause prohibiting a personal boat tied to a resident's own dock. I'd like to understand why I received this notice." The room fell silent. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, all eyes on. The president leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the table with deliberate slowness. He replied with a thin smile, "Sometimes the spirit of the rules is just as important as the letter. A large boat can disrupt the look we're maintaining here." His expression remained calm. "With respect, my boat isn't violating any written rule, and from the shoreline it's no more noticeable than the canoes or kayaks I see docked nearby." Murmurs filled the room. A few neighbors nodded subtly. Smile faded just enough to reveal his irritation. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in front of the very people he wanted to impress. After the meeting, walked home with the cool night air brushing his face. He wasn't angry, not yet. But something told him this wasn't the end of it, wasn't the type to let go once his pride was tested. Days passed and a second letter arrived, this time phrased more firmly. Then came another. Each one carried the same demand: remove the boat. Responded by filing polite but firm written replies, quoting the bylaws and requesting proof of any violation. None came. Word spread quietly among the neighbors. Some admired his composure, though few dared to say it aloud. Others whispered about his persistence, wondering why he seemed so determined. Noticed more watchful glances as he walked down the street. The atmosphere was changing, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Despite the pressure, remained steady. He took photographs of his dock, recorded every notice he received, and kept a detailed log of interactions. He knew it was only a matter of time before this tension reached a breaking point. As he sat on the deck one evening, the Horizon rocking gently against the waves, sipped his coffee and thought, "This boat isn't just wood and metal. It's my line in the sand." What didn't know yet was how far would go to break him. And what didn't know was that had the patience and precision to turn the rules themselves into his greatest weapon. The battle for control of the lakeside neighborhood had only just begun. The weeks that followed brought a subtle but steady change in Walker's daily life. At first, it was just the occasional letter from the HOA board, neatly typed and delivered in his mailbox. Then the letters became more frequent, piling up almost weekly, each with sharper language than the last. They no longer asked politely, they demanded action. Failure to comply, one letter read, will result in escalating fines. Read it carefully, then set it down on his desk. He wasn't surprised. Was the kind of man who believed persistence was the same as authority. However, had no intention of yielding simply because someone insisted loudly enough. Still, the pressure began to grow heavier. The HOA board issued surprise inspections, walking around his property with clipboards and clip-on ties, scribbling notes while avoiding his gaze. A notice soon followed claiming his lawn was slightly overgrown, though had mowed it just 2 days earlier. Another claimed his exterior lights were excessively bright, though he used the same bulbs his neighbors did. It was clear the board was working overtime, not to preserve the neighborhood's beauty, but to bend into submission. Neighbors started to take notice. Some looked at with sympathy when they passed him on the street, their expressions suggesting quiet support. Others, however, avoided his eye altogether, unwilling to be caught on the wrong side of displeasure. The neighborhood had long ago learned that silence was the easiest way to avoid conflict. However, refused to let himself be cornered. Each time he received a letter, he filed it in a neat folder. Each time someone stepped onto his property with a clipboard, he logged the date and time in his journal. He wasn't simply reacting, he was building a record, a careful, deliberate shield against the storm he knew was gathering. The tension reached a peak during the next HOA meeting. The board gathered in the community center, the usual rows of chairs filled with homeowners waiting to hear the monthly updates. Sat quietly in the back, his calm presence drawing only a few cautious nods of acknowledgement. When the floor opened for questions, he raised his hand and stood. His voice was steady but firm. "I've received multiple notices claiming violations on my property," he began, holding up a folder thick with paperwork. "I've reviewed our bylaws thoroughly. Nowhere do I see support for these claims. Can the board provide specific citations for these alleged violations?" The room went still. Homeowners glanced at one another, curiosity sparking behind their cautious expressions. Richard leaned forward in his chair, his expression controlled but tight. He said smoothly, "The board is empowered to interpret the bylaws. We determine what fits the standards of the neighborhood." Flipped a page in his folder. Interpretation doesn't mean invention. If you want residents to comply, the rules need to exist in writing. Otherwise, you're asking people to follow personal opinions, not bylaws. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few heads nodded, others looked shocked at the directness of his words. For years had faced little resistance in meetings. To be challenged so openly and with documented proof in hand was something few had dared attempt. Smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Perhaps you misunderstand," he said, his voice tightening. "We enforce the rules for the good of the neighborhood. Everyone benefits when standards are maintained." "Then show me the rule I've violated," replied evenly. The silence that followed was louder than any argument, shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. He couldn't produce a citation because none existed. The meeting moved on, but the air in the room had shifted. Neighbors exchanged glances, their thoughts clear even if their words remained unspoken. Had been challenged, and for the first time his authority looked fragile. Later that evening, returned home, the sound of crickets echoing from the shoreline. He stepped onto his deck and gazed at the horizon, its silhouette dark against the moonlit water. Despite the weight of the board's tactics, he felt steady. He wasn't fighting alone anymore, not entirely. People had seen the cracks in his armor. But he also knew one thing with certainty, would not forgive the embarrassment. The man had spent years tightening his grip on the neighborhood and had just one finger loose. As sipped his coffee and made another entry in his logbook, he thought about the storm still gathering. Had only just begun his campaign, but so had he. Wasn't the kind to retreat. He wasn't the kind to bow quietly. No matter how many letters arrived, no matter how many clipboards appeared on his property, he would not be broken. What didn't yet know was how quickly persistence would escalate, and how devastating the consequences of that persistence would soon become. Walker woke one crisp morning to find yet another envelope tucked neatly into his mailbox. By now, the sight was more routine than surprising. He slid the paper out, unfolded it, and scanned the words. Another alleged violation, this time accusing him of storing unapproved equipment on his dock. Almost laughed. The so-called equipment was nothing more than a life jacket and fishing rod. He tucked the letter into his growing folder of documentation and returned inside. What didn't realize was that every piece of paper, every baseless claim was becoming part of defense. Believed persistence wore people down, but wasn't most people. The tension between the two men was no longer a secret. Neighbors whispered when they crossed paths, glancing between calm stride and sharp, watchful eyes. Some even joked privately that the entire neighborhood felt like a chessboard, with and as players locked in a quiet but intensifying battle. The next HOA meeting brought that simmering conflict into the open. The community center filled with the usual hum of voices, but there was a restless energy in the air. Everyone knew there would be a clash, though no one said it aloud. When the floor opened, stood once again, folder in hand. His voice carried with the same steady tone as before, but this time there was more behind it, an unmistakable firmness that caught everyone's attention. "I've received multiple notices regarding so-called violations," he said. "Each time I've asked for a citation from the bylaws. Each time none has been provided. If the board continues to issue penalties without evidence, then it's not governance, it's harassment." The word hung heavy in the air. A few neighbors gasped softly, others leaned forward, eager to see how it would respond. His jaw tightened. He rose slowly from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket as if to cloak himself in authority. "Mr. Walker," he said, his tone laced with controlled irritation, "you speak as though you're above the rules. This association exists to protect the value and character of our neighborhood. Your boat, your dock, your property, these things affect everyone here. It's not about harassment, it's about standards." Didn't flinch, he met eyes unshaken. Standards come from rules written and agreed upon, not from personal opinion. The audience shifted, murmuring. For years had spoken without challenge, his words taken as final. Now in front of everyone, his authority was being questioned, and worse, weakened. Color rose in his face. "If you don't like the standards of this community," he snapped, "perhaps you should reconsider living here." That remark hit the room like a spark to dry tinder. A few neighbors frowned, others whispered, shocked by the bluntness. Let the silence stretch before replying, his voice calm but cutting. "I didn't buy this home to be told by one man how to live. I bought it because I followed the rules, paid the dues, and respected the agreement. If this association wants to enforce more than that, then it should amend its bylaws properly instead of inventing rules on the fly." The tension was undeniable now. Smile had vanished completely. His hand gripped the edge of the podium as if steadying himself. The meeting quickly moved on, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen the exchange, and everyone knew had been forced into a corner. That night sat on his deck, watching the moonlight ripple across the lake. The horizon rocked gently at the dock, as if unaware it was the center of so much conflict. His mind replayed the meeting. He hadn't set out to embarrass, but the truth had to be said. Still, he knew the man's pride wouldn't allow the moment to pass quietly. The following week confirmed his suspicion. A new letter arrived, this one colder than any before. It carried heavier fines and a warning of further consequences if failed to comply. Exhaled slowly, setting the paper down, was escalating. The fight was no longer about the boat. It was about power, ego, and dominance. Tightened his focus. He doubled his note-taking, began reviewing state property laws, and even spoke to a neighbor who had once been a lawyer. The more pushed, the more determined became. The neighborhood could feel the heat of the conflict now. Street conversations paused when either man walked by. Some quietly hoped would back down, while others secretly cheered his resolve. One thing was certain: the battle lines were drawn. As the sun set one evening, ran his hand along the railing of his dock. He could almost sense what was coming, a heavy weight pressing in. Wouldn't stop, not after being challenged so openly. And knew, deep down, that the next move wouldn't just be words on paper. The night air carried the scent of pine and the faint sound of water lapping against the shore. Walker had settled onto his deck with a cup of tea, his journal open beside him. He wrote steadily, recording the latest letter from the HOA board and the tone of the last meeting. The steady rhythm of documenting the board's actions had become his anchor. The lake was calm, the sky clear, and the horizon floated quietly at the dock as though it were part of the landscape itself. Often looked at that boat as a symbol of his independence. It was more than wood and metal, it was freedom. Watching the moonlight shimmer across its polished surface, he felt the usual calm wash over him. But that calm didn't last. Sometime past midnight, stirred in his sleep at the faint sound of popping. At first he thought it was branches snapping in the wind, but then he smelled something acrid. His eyes flew open. He rushed to the window, and what he saw made his heart stop. Flames. Orange and red tongues of fire leapt hungrily from the horizon, crackling in the night air. The boat that had carried him through quiet afternoons and serene mornings was engulfed in fire. Smoke curled upward into the dark sky, and the reflection of the flames rippled across the water like a cruel mirror. Ran outside, shouting for help as he scrambled toward the dock. The air was thick with heat and smoke. Neighbors' porch lights flicked on one by one as people stumbled from their houses in shock. Someone called the fire department, but the blaze was already too strong. Within minutes, the boat collapsed in on itself, the flames devouring everything in their path until all that remained was a smoldering skeleton. Stood there chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the destruction. His boat was gone. The firefighters arrived quickly, dousing the last of the flames and keeping the fire from spreading. When it was over, the captain approached with a sympathetic look. "It's a total loss," he said. "Do you have any idea how it started?" Shook his head, though his mind was already racing. Boats didn't just burst into flames in the middle of the night. He remembered the way his eyes had narrowed at the last meeting, the way his words had carried an edge. Had no proof, but deep inside he knew. The neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering quietly. Some looked at with pity, others with unease. No one said aloud what many of them were thinking. By the time the fire trucks rolled away, the lake was quiet again. Ash floated gently on the water where the horizon had once rested, stood on the dock long after everyone else returned to their homes. He felt an ache in his chest, not just grief, but something sharper, determination. The next morning took photographs of the charred remains. He carefully logged the time, the reports, and the damage. As he worked, a neighbor named Sarah approached, her expression hesitant. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. I don't want to say too much, but people are talking. They think this wasn't an accident." Met her eyes. "Neither do I." Sarah glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. "Been furious since that meeting. He told some people he was going to teach you a lesson. I don't have proof, but—" She trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Nodded slowly. He appreciated her courage to speak, even cautiously. "Thank you," he said simply. When she left, returned to his deck and sat in silence. The lake looked the same as always, still, serene, endless, but for him everything had changed. The horizon was gone, destroyed in the middle of the night. It wasn't just property, it was an attempt to break him. Yet instead of breaking, felt a steel resolve forming within him. Thought fire would be enough to make him surrender. He thought fear and destruction would force compliance. But wasn't built to bow. That night, as the stars shimmered above the lake, closed his journal and whispered to himself, "If he wants a battle, he'll get one, but it won't be on his terms." What didn't realize was that wasn't preparing for retaliation through anger. He was preparing to use something far more effective: knowledge, patience, and the very rules had twisted for years. The fire had taken Spot, but it had also lit something would regret. The days of bending quietly were over. The morning after the fire, Walker sat at his kitchen table, a mug of coffee warming his hands as sunlight filtered through the blinds. The lake outside shimmered as it always did, calm and indifferent to the chaos of the night before. Where the horizon once floated, now only blackened fragments drifted on the surface. Stared at them for a long time before turning to the papers spread across his table. Letters, fines, inspection reports, all neatly arranged. What had once been an annoyance had now become the foundation of a plan. If had hoped the fire would crush him, he had miscalculated. wasn't broken, he was calculating. He began with the bylaws. Over the past weeks, he had combed through every clause and subsection, memorizing the language. What stood out most was the board's dependency on procedure. Nothing of significance, no budget approval, no contractor hearing, no community project, could move forward without board signatures. Specifically, a quorum was required. If even a few members their approval, the process ground to a halt. Smiled faintly as realization settled in. Might be loud, but his power lived and died by procedure. And procedure could be turned into a weapon. That evening, called on a few neighbors he knew were quietly discontent. Sarah, who had spoken to him after the fire, agreed to meet on her porch. She listened as explained what he had found in the bylaws. "If we have just enough people on the board who refuse to sign off," said, "nothing gets done. Budgets stall, maintenance stalls, everything freezes, and it's all perfectly within the rules." Sarah hesitated, but wouldn't that make life harder for everyone? "At first, yes," admitted. "But the frustration won't fall on us, it'll fall on. People already see him as the one driving this conflict. If things stop working, they'll start questioning his leadership." Sarah considered his words, then nodded slowly. "I'll talk to a couple of people I trust." Within days, had quiet support from 2 board members who had grown tired of his heavy hand. They weren't eager for open conflict, but they were willing to withhold their signatures when it mattered. It was enough. The next HOA meeting was tense from the start. Pushed through his agenda with his usual certainty, a landscaping project, a contractor hire, new signage for the entrance. But when the papers went around for board approval, a small but significant shift occurred. Signatures were missing, motions stalled, pressed, demanded explanations, but the members remained vague. "I'll need time to review this," one said carefully. "I'm not comfortable approving this without further discussion," said another. His frustration was visible. He shuffled the papers, tapped his pen, and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Fine," he said sharply. "We'll revisit this next month." Sat quietly in the back, watching. He didn't need to speak. The silence of signatures spoke louder than any challenge. Over the next few weeks, the results became clear. Lawn crews stopped coming because invoices weren't paid. Streetlights went dark because maintenance contracts weren't renewed. Even the trash service issued a warning about late payments. Neighbors grew restless. At first, they complained to each other in hushed tones, but soon the complaints turned louder. They wanted answers. Why wasn't the grass cut? Why were the lights out? Why were services failing? Tried to deflect, but his polished words rang hollow. Everyone had seen him boast of control for years, and now that control was slipping. The frustration didn't spread it spread to the man who had promised order and delivered chaos. Meanwhile, kept his role quiet. He walked the streets calmly, offered polite greetings, and never raised his voice. When asked about the problems, he only shrugged and said, "I'm sure the board will figure it out." Privately, however, he continued meeting with his small circle of allies, encouraging them to hold firm. "The more things stall, the more people will see that sway isn't working," he told them. "We don't need to fight loudly, we just need to let silence do the work." By the end of the month, the HOA was paralyzed. Its once confident demeanor had given way to visible strain. At meetings, his tone grew sharper, his patience thinner. He was no longer the unshakable president commanding the room. He was a frustrated man trying desperately to push against walls that wouldn't move. Meanwhile, remained composed. The fire had taken the horizon, but in its place, he had built something stronger. A strategy that required no shouting, no accusations. Just patience, precision, and the quiet refusal to comply with tyranny. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but the tide was turning. The effects of his quiet counterattack rippled through the neighborhood like waves across the lake. At first, the changes were small. Overgrown grass near the entrance sign, a couple of broken lamps left unrepaired. But as the weeks stretched on, the problems grew harder to ignore. By the 3rd week, the trash pickup had been delayed twice. Recycling bins overflowed, and neighbors began grumbling in driveways. The once pristine landscaping at the neighborhood's entrance looked tired, with weeds sprouting where flowers used to bloom. Even the fountain, long a centerpiece near the main road, sputtered weakly before shutting down entirely. For years, residents had praised the HOA for keeping everything polished and orderly. Now, those same residents stared at the mounting neglect with dismay. And while tried to insist it was only temporary inconvenience, people weren't convinced. At a Saturday morning gathering near the lake, overheard the shifting tone. A group of neighbors stood in a circle, their voices carrying easily. "This is ridiculous," one man muttered. "We pay dues every month, where's the money going?" Another shook her head. "Says it's just delays, but it's been weeks. My kids can't even ride their bikes safely with the streetlights out." "Maybe," Sarah said carefully, "it's not delays at all, maybe it's leadership." Her words hung in the air, quiet but bold. For the first time, someone voiced what many had been thinking. Stayed silent, listening. He had no need to insert himself yet. The frustration was growing naturally. And frustration, he knew, could be more powerful than any speech. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was undeniable. The chairs filled quickly, more residents attending than usual. Voices rose before the session even started, complaints spilling into the room. When tried to call for order, he had to tap his gavel twice before the noise settled. "Let's begin," said, his smile stiff. "I want to assure you that all services will be restored shortly. We've simply run into minor procedural issues." "Procedural?" a man interrupted. "You mean unpaid bills? The lawn service quit because they weren't paid. That's not minor." Smile faltered. "We're resolving those matters." Another woman raised her hand sharply. "My street has been dark for a month. What exactly are our dues covering?" The murmurs turned into louder demands. Shuffled papers trying to project authority, but the cracks were showing. And then, almost inevitably, someone turned too. "You've been asking questions for weeks, haven't you? What's really going on?" Rose slowly, his folder in hand. He didn't raise his voice or pound the table. He simply spoke with calm clarity. "The board cannot approve payments or contracts without proper signatures," he explained. "That's in the bylaws. Recently, those signatures haven't been unanimous. That's why things are stalled." The room buzzed. People turned to each other, processing his words. "So this is about the board?" a neighbor asked. Nodded. "About accountability. It's not about dues or residents failing. It's about leadership making choices that don't reflect the bylaws." Cut in quickly. "Don't twist this. You've been obstructing progress deliberately. You're sabotaging the neighborhood." But his words only fueled the unrest. A man near the back shook his head. "No, Richard, he's telling us what's actually happening. You're the one who promised order and delivered none." The shift was tangible. For the first time, the room wasn't leaning towards polished speeches. It was leaning towards steady explanations. After the meeting, several neighbors approached quietly. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others asked to see the documents he had collected. Shared them freely, careful not to push, simply presenting facts. One evening, Sarah stopped by his house with a plate of cookies and a determined look. People are starting to see it. They're realizing isn't untouchable anymore. Smiled faintly, though his eyes carried the weight of caution. Realizing is one thing, acting is another, but yes, the tide is turning. As summer deepened, the neighborhood grew restless. The once quiet whispers now turned into open complaints. Where had once been praised as the force keeping everything pristine, he was now seen as the obstacle standing in the way. Meanwhile, stayed composed. He didn't campaign or shout. He let the rules, the silence of stalled approvals, and the visible neglect speak for themselves. The lake outside his window reflected the evening sky as wrote in his journal. He paused, listening to the faint laughter of children playing nearby, the sound carrying in the still air. The neighborhood wasn't broken, it was waking up. And once awake, there would be no going back. The summer heat pressed down on the neighborhood, but it wasn't just the temperature that made the air heavy. It was anticipation. Word had spread quickly about the next HOA meeting, and by evening the clubhouse was overflowing. Folding chairs had been pulled from closets, and still, residents lined the back walls, arms crossed and expressions expectant. Richard sat at the head of the long table, gavel in hand. his posture rigid. He had dressed sharply, as always, but the circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. He tried to smile to project control, but the room was buzzing with restless energy. Arrived quietly, a thick folder under his arm. He wasn't here to grandstand. He was here to finish what himself had started when he underestimated him. Tap the gavel. Order, please. Let's proceed with tonight's agenda. Before he could continue, a man in the audience stood. Forget the agenda. We want answers. Why hasn't the landscaping crew been paid? Why are the streetlights still out? A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd. His jaw tightened. As I've explained, there have been delays in processing contracts, nothing more. Rose slowly. With respect, that's not the full truth. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the packed room. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Mr. has avoided approvals for months, continued, setting his folder on the table. According to the bylaws, all expenditures and contracts require proper signatures. When the board cannot reach consensus, nothing can move forward. That's the law we all agreed to. Slammed his gavel against the wood. This is slander. He's twisting the rules to paralyze us. Calmly slid a stack of papers forward. These are board minutes. They show exactly which votes failed. And here, he tapped another document, are the invoices that went unpaid because approval wasn't secured. The vendors didn't walk away. They were stalled. The room grew louder with murmurs. Neighbors leaned in, whispering, frowning. Someone near the front said, "So all this time, it wasn't the vendors, it was him." Didn't nod, didn't smile. He simply let the silence confirm it. His voice cracked as he tried to recover. He's been blocking signatures himself. He's the reason nothing moves forward. Finally looked directly at him. I voted against proposals that violated the bylaws. The rules exist for fairness. Ignoring them is not leadership, it's control. And this community deserves better than being kept in the dark. The tension snapped. People began speaking over one another, some shouting questions, others demanding explain himself. His polished composure unraveled as he raised his voice in desperation, trying to regain authority. Enough, barked. I built this neighborhood. I kept it perfect for years while you all enjoyed the benefits. And now one man thinks he can tear it down with paperwork and whispers. His words echoed, but they landed wrong. The prideful declaration only deepened the divide. Residents looked at one another, shaking their heads. Finally, Sarah stood. Her voice was firm, clear. You didn't build this neighborhood, Richard. We all did, every family, every homeowner, and right now we're watching it fall apart under your watch. That's not pride, that's failure. Applause broke out, not wild or chaotic, but steady, deliberate. It grew louder as more neighbors joined in, until the sound filled the room. His face flushed red, his hand trembling as he gripped the gavel. Stayed still, letting the moment belong to the community. For the first time, they weren't afraid to speak. When the applause subsided, addressed the board. The bylaws provide a solution. If the community believes its leadership has failed, they can call for a vote of removal. Tonight, the residents are here. Tonight, they can decide. The room erupted. Some cheered, others raised their hands in immediate agreement, tried to shout them down, but his voice was drowned in the clamor. A neighbor near the back called out, "Let's put it to paper, let's vote tonight." Slammed his gavel again, but it was no use. His authority had slipped through his fingers. Leaned back, his expression calm. He hadn't raised his voice once, yet the tide had turned completely. The very rules once wielded like a weapon had become the tools of his undoing. By the end of the night, a petition had been circulated, signatures flooding the pages. The residents were no longer just whispering, they were acting. Stormed out of the clubhouse, the gavel abandoned on the table behind him. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the pavement until they faded into the humid night. Gathered his folder and quietly helped stack the leftover chairs. The fight wasn't finished, but the momentum had shifted. The community wasn't his to control, it had awakened for itself. As he stepped into the cool night air, looked toward the lake where his boat once floated, had thought destroying it would break him. Instead, it had lit a fire that spread through every neighbor, every street, every home. The showdown wasn't over, but Richard's reign was. The morning after the chaotic meeting, the neighborhood felt different. Conversations spilled across driveways, voices animated with a new kind of energy. For years, the residents had lived under the polished image of Richard's leadership. Now, for the first time, they were realizing that image had cracks, and they weren't afraid to face them. Sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching neighbors gather in small groups. Children rode bikes down streets that were still dim without working lamps, but laughter returned to the air. The community wasn't whole yet, but something had shifted. They had taken the first step toward reclaiming ownership of their neighborhood. By the following week, the petition was complete. The signatures filled page after page, more than enough to trigger a vote of removal. Tried to mount a defense, sending letters to residents and even making phone calls, but the momentum was against him. The once unquestioned president now seemed desperate, clinging to power rather than earning it. The official vote was scheduled in the same clubhouse where the showdown had occurred. This time, the turnout was even larger. Residents arrived early, carrying determination in their expressions. Families who rarely participated before showed up, eager to have their voices heard. Entered with his usual crisp suit, but his shoulders slumped under the weight of inevitability. He made one final speech, reminding everyone of the years of order, the manicured lawns, the perfectly functioning gates. He begged them to remember the neighborhood at its best. But then stepped forward not as an enemy but as a neighbor. He spoke plainly, reminding everyone that leadership wasn't about perfection on the surface. It was about fairness, transparency, and trust. "This community belongs to all of us," he said, his voice steady. "Not to one man, not even to me. The bylaws were written to protect us, and we followed them. Now it's time for us to choose." When the ballots were counted, the result was overwhelming. Richard was removed as president. The announcement was met with applause, not of triumph over a man, but of relief. The burden had been lifted. Stood frozen for a moment, his lips pressed tightly. Without a word, he walked out of the clubhouse, his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. For the first time in years, he had no control over the outcome. The board held a quick reorganization vote, and despite his reluctance, was nominated. Neighbors urged him to take the role, assuring him he had earned their trust. He hesitated, not seeking power, but realizing leadership was sometimes less about wanting and more about answering when called. He accepted, but with a promise. "This won't be about control," he told them. "This will be about balance. No one should ever feel powerless in their own neighborhood again." The weeks that followed marked a transformation. Vendors returned, contracts were signed, and services were restored. The fountain flowed once more, streetlights flickered back to life, and the lawns regained their neat trim. But more importantly, neighbors became participants instead of bystanders. Meetings were full, voices were heard, and decisions reflected a collective will rather than one man's pride. Didn't revel in its downfall. He kept his focus on rebuilding trust. He encouraged committees, opened financial books, and created a system where transparency wasn't optional. Slowly, the fear that had once hovered over the neighborhood was replaced with something brighter: confidence. One evening, Sarah joined by the lake. The water shimmered under the setting sun, calm and steady. "You know," she said, "when your boat burned, I thought that was the end for you, but somehow it became the beginning for all of us." Smiled faintly, his eyes on the horizon. "He wanted to break me, but he reminded me what's worth standing for, not a boat, not even rules on paper. It's the people who live here, that's what matters." The lake no longer carried the ghost of loss. Instead, it reflected resilience. Had proven that even when one man tried to impose control, a community could rise stronger than before. Never returned to the meetings. His house, once the center of attention, grew quiet. He became a figure of the past, a reminder of what happens when leadership crosses into control. For peace finally settled in. He no longer carried the weight of being the lone voice against. Now he was part of a chorus, a community that had found its strength. As the night deepened, lanterns lit along the freshly repaired pathways, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Families gathered outside, laughter drifting across the streets. The neighborhood was alive again, not because of one man's rule, but because of everyone's voice. Leaned back in his chair, listening, the fight was over. The lake, the streets, the homes, they all felt different now. Not perfect, but honest. And that honesty was far stronger than the illusion of perfection had ever been. The HOA had tried to break him. Instead, it had awakened something greater. And as the stars emerged above the quiet lake, knew he had finally won, not just for himself, but for all of them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.